This is Scorched Vine, a Vin Noir's production of Hope's Nocturne, written by OPL Noir, performed by Carrie Storm. Chapter 3, Hope's Pillars, Present Day. Manaus lumbered across the dark rocks and brittle seashells that made up Antum Cove, a natural depression within the topography. It could only be accessed by either climbing down steep, heavily vegetated terrain or riding a pontoon into the cove. This spot was quickly becoming his new favorite haunt. With old dogwood trees, the sound of their rustling leaves, brine-saturated wind, and frothy sea for company, he could sort himself out. He knew he should leave. He needed to make his way to Peter's hut in Old Town. There, they would meet up with Jocthan to pick up odd jobs. They all needed to earn extra cash for one thing or another, but he needed it most. Peter, the oldest of their little ragtag bunch, lived with his little brother David and their father, Mr. Ali, in a small bungalow. Fashionable in its time, it occupied a prime spot in what had been Antum's Upper East Side. Settled in the mid-15th century, it became a sprawling merchant town and Ribera's center of commerce. However, in the late 15th century, when the plague made living in overpopulated towns less enviable, the grand estates and sprawling lawns became all the rage. The elite moved inland, where the terrain could accommodate their grand facades. Uptown became Old Town, eventually called Old Ton, with working-class families and migrant communities scraping out a living. Peter insisted that he needed seed money to build his coffee empire. Jocthan claimed he'd simply be servicing his future clients. Manaus simply needed to help his grandmother make ends meet. A part of him suspected they tagged along so that he wouldn't be alone. Today, however, he lingered in the cove. He had a lot to sort through. He also knew they would look for him there when they didn't find him at the usual spot. For now, he'd take this quiet intermission from the noise of his life, allowing himself a few minutes to deal with his whirlwind of emotions. Every one of his muscles hurt. Veering towards a cluster of bleached driftwood, he plopped his backside on the largest one, grunting on impact. Bracing his elbows against his knees, he sighed, staring down at the smooth, dark pebbles strewn over the coast. For the first time in months, despite ever-present pain, Manaus felt good. Today's impromptu game gave him the opportunity to exorcise some of the turmoil plaguing him. If anyone ever asked him whether he could always count on the support and strength of his mother's brother and her family, he would have dismissed the question as absurd. His belief in them as a pillar of support was unwavering. However, words uttered by his uncle just weeks after his mother's funeral shook his belief in that pillar to the core. In addition to the loss of his mother, with his father barely coping after her funeral, the unexpected loss of her side of the family had been devastating. What was he talking about? Manaus wondered, staring out over the ocean towards Canacal, his home, as he remembered the day a month ago when his last pillar of strength crumbled. Manaus hadn't cried since the funeral. Today, however, he couldn't help himself. A torrent of tears flowed without restraint, cascading down his cheeks. His grief, anger, and outrage at all he'd lost, including everyone he'd held dear, broke through that fragile barrier of strength and resilience he thought he'd had. Stiffening his upper lip, he tried to make them stop. At 16, he wasn't a little boy anymore, and the time for tears had passed. He hated tears, considering them useless and ineffectual in achieving real change. But he couldn't make them stop. Today's sun hung high in the sky, but the wind carried winter's chill, cooling his cheeks and the tears that stained them. Apart from the howling wind, a cold silence lingered throughout their vineyard in the cove. Stifling stillness saturated the atmosphere since his mother's loss. Nothing moved but the breeze between the leaves and the sun's streak as it traversed the sky. It was mid-September, time to harvest, but his father had decided to leave the berries for the birds. Snow covered a larger portion of the mountains, like a fine layer of dust covering everything in their house. In the weeks since he'd been home, they'd made no progress with the vineyard. It looked a woody, overgrown mess, and while he'd had no success changing his father's mood, today he marveled at a bunch of little spiders spinning their webs on the limb of a nearby vine, and a colony of ants gathering their winter provisions as they made their way across the yard. It seemed as if life went on everywhere else but here. He felt a chill as he sat on the veranda's last step. At least someone is getting something done, Manaus lamented, gazing wistfully at the emptiness in front of him. This late in the season, the air should be saturated with the smell of wine must. He should hear the high-pitched sound of women singing, their undulating tones reverberating off the nearby hills and mountains. The air should be filled with life. Multiple tables overflowing with bread and food should occupy the front yard, and his mother should be going in and out of the front door, smiling, carrying food, and greeting their friends. Instead, the air was filled with the sound of birds and the smell of winter's crispy air. His father would let the fruit fall on the ground this year. At the sound of tires crunching the aggregate, Manaus turned, watching his uncle exit the family's old pickup. He felt the stirring of hope. Help had arrived. He hadn't seen or heard from the man since the funeral. Dressed in black, Kikula didn't meet his gaze or offer his usual welcoming smile. He just lumbered across the yard, eyes downcast. Manaus's hope began to shrivel. His mother's eyes were a warm and welcoming espresso, always inviting. His uncle, while loving and wise, had the eyes of a fathomless onyx, sharp and piercing. He missed nothing, shied away from nothing. He was looking at a side of the man he'd never seen before. Kikula looked broken. His face looked as pained as Manaus felt. Twice Manaus's size, the man curled himself into a small spot next to him. They sat like this in a comfortable silence for what felt like hours, staring at the vineyard's heavy, fruit-laden branches swaying in the wind, staring at their leaves curling with September's chill. He absent-mindedly glared at their colors of deep purple and bright orange. Manaus noticed that Kikula's palms looked red and irritated, which meant he'd spent the day on one of the schooners with his men, catching fish. Although he didn't smell like he'd been fishing, he smelled of the stuff he kept in an old bottle shaped like a corsair's ship. His mother called it Kikula's bespoke fumes. Usually whenever she was mad at him, he'd cleaned up, and Manaus knew he was dealing with the councilman, the cleric, and family business administrator, not the fisherman. The fisherman was easygoing and a good listener. The councilman was usually harried and less inclined to hear him out. His uncle looked him over. Small beginnings, he said, smiling. You need to look up. Your answers aren't written in the dirt. Small beginnings. Manaus frowned. So I'm that again. The name had been a term of endearment when he was younger. His mother, however, hated it. So she made Kikula stop using it. It was a testament to his mindset that he'd used it today. Whatever you're about to say, Mom wouldn't like it, and you know it, Manaus thought. Kikula leaned towards him and, without preamble, whispered, I can't help you, Manaus. Turning away, he heaved a sigh, then continued, Please, forgive this old fool his pain. Manaus turned his back towards him. He refused to look at the man. He couldn't. Kikula so resembled his mother, an older male version of her. They shared the same neat features, high cheekbones, and warm dark chocolate skin. It felt too painful to look at him. It felt like it was her, refusing him aid. He didn't understand his uncle's argument. They were all in pain, so in what way did his pain affect his ability to help a family member in need? It was perplexing. The entire situation made Manaus's head hurt, so he continued to stare straight ahead, glaring at the now graying sky, with the diminishing light winking between the vines and leaves. He looked anywhere but at the man he considered a pillar in his life. Young people and their lofty ideals, Kikula huffed, breaking the silence. He threw his head back, leaning against the pillar supporting the overhang as he gaped up at the sky. Pretty words, beautiful ideas, and the warm fuzzies don't prepare you for the harsh realities of this world. Dropping his head, staring at his clenched fists, he continued, "They were warned not to marry. But then," he growled, "then you came, and there was no question. And now she's gone." He chuckled, or maybe cried, his disjointed words cracking towards the end. Confused by the older man's words, Manaus could only turn and stare at Kikula. He was not making sense. None of it had any bearing on lending aid to the destitute. Even his physical state seemed at odds with the reality surrounding him. The man was sweating in the cold September breeze. He also seemed to be in the middle of a conflagration of emotions. Anger in his clenched fist, grief in his downcast features and hollowed cheeks, warring with the pain and conflict in his eyes. "Please don't misunderstand me. I believe in love. It's not glib. I believe it's courageous, overcomes all things, and is long-suffering," he clarified, seeming to regain some of his strength, gesturing with his arms at something in the grand scheme. In the old days, a man had his heir nailed to a piece of wood, forever carrying that price, the evidence of his love for his family in his flesh. For love, Hosea showed the definition of love as truly long-suffering when he married Gomer, repeatedly chasing after her, cleaning her up as she chased after others. Then we saw the very face of love, when a man was willing to suffer the pain and curse of the cross by allowing himself to be nailed on a tree. He sighed. Love doesn't take away from those he loves. He protects them. She should have been protected. He blames Dad for what happened, Manaus realized. You know, when my grandparents decided to leave Cameroon, their elders, their grandparents, told them that they were crazy. Who would want to leave such a beautiful land? But Grandpa and those of his generation were all too familiar with what he referred to as those Europeans in the Congo and their thirst for limbs. You see, they'd already had their fill of life and its atrocities suffered under the Kaiser. And after World War I, when their home was divided between the British and the French, he wasn't willing to take a chance with his family. I've often wondered how hard it must have been for him to leave, usually when I've had a hard day on the boat. Then I think about those who were taken hostage from their homes. I've often wondered what gave so many the will, the tenacity to survive where there was no hope, to survive capture, a long, arduous journey, the Middle Passage, slavery, emancipation, colonization, reconstruction. They were repressed, oppressed, burned out, hanged, yet they kept rising. Now, I can talk to you about light coming after the darkness, about joy coming in the morning. But for them to keep putting one foot in front of the other in spite of the odds took phenomenal strength of character. They had to have somehow found the will to survive, despite the fact that their entire existence was one big nightmare with no end in sight. It's not just that their way out was taken away from them, but also that their will to live transcended their daily existence. Do you get what I'm saying? Their will to survive overrode their need for relief. Now, I suspect that they were somehow able to hold on to hope for their next generation, but I still wonder how they overcame their minute-by-minute struggle. Kikula surprised him by reaching over and grasping his hand. Manaus had nothing left. He'd run out of tears, felt hollow, and the gesture seemed empty to him. The last bit of hope he'd struggled to hold on to was now gone. He didn't resist the man, however, or pull back his hand. He felt no anger towards him, just apathy. I know that nothing of what I'm saying makes any sense right now, but if you remember anything that I've said today, please remember this. It's time to swim, little minnow. While we fight over so many things, things without consequence, things without meaning or endurance, we lose sight of what's truly important. What's important here is that your generation, you, are the culmination of our hope. From all those that struggled before with nothing to hold on to but hope, to your great-grandfather who left his home, on down, you are our legacy. This struggle is over your family's future and what the Guild considers their right to that legacy. Don't forget it. Kikila heaved a sigh. I see her legacy when I look at you. I am sorry, Manos. Remember, in the face of so great a hope and responsibility, you don't have the luxury of sinking. So swim, he finished. Kikula left as quickly as he'd come. His tall, broad form became a silhouette against the setting sun. Arms that had once lifted Manos into the air were rigid at his sides, his fists clenched as he marched up the hill to his truck. Manos had hoped for help in speaking with his father, or at least a place to say, but neither would be forthcoming. This was Chapter 3 of Hope's Nocturne, Hope's Pillars, present day. If you enjoy these episodes, please join us every Thursday when we will endeavor to read another excerpt from Hope's Nocturne. If, however, you're like me and can't wait to see what Kikila will do next, or Manos for that matter, you can purchase Hope Nocturne wherever books are sold very soon. Until then, join us again next Thursday.